Hello, welcome to the Arts First podcast, the podcast dedicated to freedom of expression in the arts and celebrating arts for art's sake. My name is Wendy Earle, and in this episode we have another recording from the Battle of Ideas 2025, kindly supplied by their recording team. Though it was not made to be an Arts First podcast, I attended the discussion and found it so interesting that I wanted to share it here. The title of the session is What Does Post-Woke Art Look Like? Chairing the discussion is Vicky Richardson, who has appeared on previous episodes, and she has a wide-ranging experience of the arts with a background in architecture and curation, and she does a great job of steering this discussion. So she introduces the theme and the speakers, so I'll hand over to her now, and I hope you enjoy the show.
We could start. Good morning, everyone. I'm Vicky Richardson. Really happy to be chairing this interesting discussion. So this session is what does post-woke art look like? Which I was just saying, it feels a little bit like an A-level art history question, you know, where you have to try and unravel the question before you can start to give the answer. But it's really a brilliant question to be asking this week because, as you probably know, it's Frieze Week in London. And so there's masses of discussion and, kind of social media activity and speculation about what's going on in the art world at the moment, both at the kind of institutional level, but also in the commercial art world, where, as you probably know, some of the major galleries are really experiencing crashes in their sales at the moment, and so there are big question marks, I think, over both, all areas of the art world, as well as what's called a sort of vibe shift, the impact of political change on the art world, and some key voices really beginning to express kind of concerns and raising questions that I think probably they wouldn't have dared to raise maybe 5 years ago. So we are seeing, the blurb for the session mentioned a key article called The Painted Protest by an art critic called Dean Kissick. But there have been other voices, some of them are on our panel today, but also people like Ben Davis and writers within the kind of, within the sort of range of art critics. And I think also interesting to see that there's a sort of institutional shift going on where the newish director of the British Museum, for example, has kind of restated the universalist aspirations of the British Museum, although, obviously not quite art, but related. And also interesting to note that the National Gallery is planning to build a major new wing devoted to Western art, which it's explicitly said it wants to be the focus. So it's things are moving. I went to Frieze London this week, and I must say I was kind of it certainly didn't feel that we were in a post-woke world when I walked around, because I think the key themes that for me seem to be very much more of the same, although a shift perhaps towards a kind of, slightly bland, naive, flowery sort of view of the world. But it'd be fascinating to see what our panel experienced of that. A photographer friend of mine actually said that he'd been photographing people's shoes, and that had been more interesting than the artwork. And I have to say, I really kind of sympathise with that point of view. It really, Frieze has become a spectacle of people, and it's brilliant from that point of view. People watching, people from all over the world. So lots to talk about. We've got a really amazing panel of critics, historians, artists. So I'm going to introduce everybody fairly quickly, but if you want to read the full biographies, they're on the Battle website. So on my far right, J.J. Charlesworth is a writer and an art critic. He's been on the staff of Art Review magazine for nearly 20 years, I think. And his book Criticism, Art and Theory in 1970s Britain came out last year, published by Routledge. On my right is Maria Lizagorskaya, who's one of the co-founders of Assemble, which is an art and architecture collective. And she's actually made a piece of work for free sculpture, which you can see in Regent's Park, Fibre Dog, which is really fantastic work. I thoroughly recommend going to have a look at that. But Maria's had a lot of experience building art spaces as well, such as the Atelier Luma building in Arles, and actually lots of other kind of art spaces. And she's also a Royal Academician. Well, Assemble, I should say, is a Royal Academician, and Maria is the key sort of representative. So she's very involved in all the debates and discussions at the RA. On my left is Pierre Delancazé, who is art critic of The Critic magazine. He also set up his own space for experimentation in aesthetics and for hosting the difficult conversations which drive today's culture, which is called Verdurin, and it's in East London. And I really recommend following it on Instagram, and has already put on some amazing events and discussions. And I think there's a shop as well.
There is.
Right.
It always helps.
And on my far left is Dr. Ella Nixon, who's a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Cambridge. And she specialises in 20th century British art and has curated various exhibitions. And she writes weekly for her own Substack, which is called The Artful Dodger. So, fantastic panel. They're each going to speak for around 5 minutes, and then we'll have some discussion, but very keen to obviously open up to questions and points from all of you. So we're going to start, I forgot the order that we actually agreed with speaking.
JJ starts.
Yes. Actually, one thing I should say is that we're missing Ian Pace, which is a great pity because Ian is a musician and a theorist of music, and unfortunately Ian's not well, so that's why he's not with us. But I think what we'll do is start on the right and work our way leftwards.
Okay. Thank you, Vicky. That's good, right? Yes, good. So obviously it's one of those questions that provokes a kind of absurd question. How do we know what art is going to look like? I'm a critic. Don't have a crystal ball. I'm not here to make prognostications or prophecies about what art might look like. And obviously we're probably going to discuss what we mean by woke art, and even dispute maybe whether it actually exists. And if we agree that it does exist, we might actually disagree as to whether it's not a bad thing and it should stay the way it is. So, but for me, what I want to start with is to kind of establish some of the kind of frameworks or kind of outlines of what I think we mean when we talk about woke art. I think it's always a bit of a not a pejorative, but I find it always a bit of a kind of clunky and obviously complicated term to use. I prefer to use it in quotes. It's one of those words where everybody sort of knows what everybody means. I'm not always keen on its pejorative aspect, but it condenses a lot of things which have trends and developments which have taken over, I think, in the arts and in culture and in academia and in large swathes of cultural life in the West over maybe the last 10 years. People will say that maybe woke used to be called political correctness. It could be identity politics run wild. Either way, we kind of know what we're talking about when we talk about woke. For me, it's really the best way that I kind of understand the term is that we are living in a period where what were radical, progressive, liberal tendencies in culture and politics have risen to the fore and have become something of a consensus. Within the arts and within art, in visual art as part of the arts, I think the way that it's expressed, or one of the aspects that it expresses itself most strongly, is that there is now pretty much a consensus within the art academy, art institutions, curatorial practice, and artists themselves, that art is essentially a proxy for politics. Right, that's quite important. The idea that everybody thinks that what they should be doing, because in the arts, is to promote and advance some form of progressive politics through the proxy of art, is what has become a dominant trope. Right, it's become a dominant form of self-identification of what it is you do when you're making art. Now, it is, at one level, one has to have a very quick one, I think, has to establish a very quick, sketchy history of it, because as someone who's lived in the art world, essentially I'm a creature of the institution. In that sense, I went to art college. I never left, I left art college, but then I became a writer. Then I started writing for magazines. Then I started editing a magazine. Then I went, so on. But the fact is that there seems to be a history of the emergence and the development of radical, progressive politics within the arts, within visual art, that has two phases to it, I think. The first phase is a long one. It's from the end of the Cold War, around the early 90s, and it carries on through till about the mid-2010s. That period is the one where there's an eclectic assimilation of a lot of what were quite left field, radical, intellectual, political, and philosophical perspectives within the Arts Academy and within the humanities themselves. Right, I remember that very distinctly. When you were at Goldsmith College in the mid-90s, you were reading, psychoanalysis by Jacques Lacan. You were reading Georges Bataille, a lot of French post-structuralists. You were reading a great deal of feminist psychoanalytical theory and this kind of thing. So there was a period in which a lot of what was post-60s theory and politics was becoming assimilated to the discourses that you found at your disposal in the visual arts field. That's all good. Good. You could have arguments about it. I certainly had a lot of arguments about all those kinds of theories and what they meant in practice. By the mid-2010s, something happens. So 10 years ago, something starts to go wrong. Actually, 9 years ago. And a different phase happens. And essentially, it's the great panic that sets in after Brexit and Trump. Right. So my experience of the last 10 years has been completely different to my experience of the art world in the previous 15, because suddenly we found ourselves in a world where everybody was at each other's throats, because they all thought that there was another side out there that was out to get them. This is the period of cancel culture, right? Cancel culture in its most intense form, in its most kind of virulent form, and it completely took over the art world. I have to say, starts from that point, right? And it's in that period that it's in the last 10 years that we see that the art world has become increasingly orthodox and monological in terms of the values, politics, theories that you are supposed to espouse if you are to have access to its institutions, its funding, its gallery system, its public gallery system, and so on. And if you have a quick think about it, the first time I started seeing that there were serious issues at stake, there were kind of Antifa kind of activists coming after, or art students and other kind of art people coming after other artists who were setting up weird little galleries that seemed to have something to do with the alt-right. Then they came for the TERFs. Then it was BLM and lockdown, and so the whole kind of decolonization discourse and politics, which had been sort of developing quite importantly in academia and in the arts and the art school in the previous 10 years, really exploded. And then, of course, in the last 2 years, you've seen the huge splits and the cancellation and marginalization and all around the issue of Palestine, Gaza, Israel, right? So you cannot move anywhere without nailing your colors to a particular mast. And if you nail your colors to the wrong mast, or if you put your head above the parapet on any of these issues in the art scene, you're in a lot of trouble, right? So now, whatever you think about the politics of those issues, the dynamic is to make the art scene more and more concentrated around the same issues, right? It becomes more and more homogenous. It becomes less tolerant of alternatives, and it means that essentially, if you have anything of interest, or if you have any interests outside of those positions, you might as well go and find another job. The institutional response to all that was simply to double down, so that now institutions are, when I say institutions, I mean galleries, museums, publicly funded organizations, philanthropically funded organizations. All of these are essentially, for the time being, doubling down on identity politics, politics of representation, and so on. So what it produces, and this is to quickly kind of talk about what things actually look like, because I've just talked about institutions, but I think there's a real issue about there's a real problem with a visual art or any kind of genre of the arts. It's not just talking contemporary visual art. We could be talking about dance or music or whatever. I think there's an issue when if the root motivation is politics by proxy, it actually has a very bad effect, and it has a very serious effect on whether you think the artwork is any good, and whether you care that the art should be interesting or valuable or good in any terms which aren't specified by the politics by proxy that you're setting up. Now, what this does, in my experience, is make for very boring art. Not because essentially the function of the art becomes about messages, and it becomes about orthodox messaging, right? And it does not tolerate ambiguity, contradiction, layeredness, subtlety, nuance, and so on. And you see it all the time. So I don't have a problem with people bringing politics to their artwork. I've been struggling recently with a piece of writing about Isaac Julien's extraordinary film installation. Once again, statues never die. It's an unbelievable piece of work, right? It is about the legacy of imperial museums. It is about race politics in America and in the 20th century, both in America and in Europe. But it's an extraordinary piece of artwork, and it affects you at very many different levels. And it is also an absolute masterpiece of film art, right? So the point about that is that you can look at that and say, yes, it has its politics. Yes, it is interested in its perspective. It is complex, and it is multivalent. It is about being black and the history of slavery and the history of the museums and being gay. There's so many things going on in it. This is a great piece of artwork, right? Whereas you can see a piece of very kind of perfunctory work in the Tate Turbine Hall at the moment by a Sami artist called Marat Sarah, which is about being a Sami artist, a Sami person, and it's not that the identity politics of the work shouldn't be acknowledged, that someone's experience as a different kind of person from a different part of the world shouldn't be acknowledged. Just it's a very, very clumsy piece of work, right? Whose symbolism, artifacts, materials use are basic and inarticulate. That requires me to say that from the perspective of there being a tradition of art making that has understood that certain things work in certain ways and could be done better, can be developed. Essentially, we're talking about aesthetics. But what I resent and I find very troubling at the moment is that because we have lots of messaging, we have no attention to whether the art performs any other value for the spectator in a way which is, any more than fulfilling the criteria of the messages and the consensus position that it is seeking to establish. Finally, so what would it look like? The art after this period, right? If we were looking for if we were saying this is a problem, we should move forward. The first condition would be to abolish cancel culture, quite simply. And we cannot can no longer function in a culture where any difference of opinion becomes grounds for a war between individuals, right? We have to put institutions back on the spot about the values that they espouse as cultural institutions in terms of what they value in the artwork, right? So that we have to kind of question whether this kind of politics is adequate to making interesting and valuable and worthy artwork for audiences. And we have to ask whether we have to insist that people, institutions, artists think about artworks as things which have their own independence and are multivalent, have different possibilities, perspectives, and are not entirely beholden to the politics by proxy imperative that seems to now dominate the field as it is. So that's where I'm going to leave that.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you, JB.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm not going to be as articulate because I'm not an art critic or don't really write about art. I'm not even trained as an artist. I trained as an architect and sometimes make things which seem to be artworks. But I guess studying architecture has made me think a lot about how things are made and who makes them, because buildings take ages to be built. And so I think that kind of question is a really interesting one about who and why and the kind of identity and where materials are coming from. They're very important for us. Even getting tea now in a cafe here, single origin tea or whatever, there's obviously an interest at the moment about where things are coming from. And I understand that sometimes it becomes a bit sort of bandwagony, but there's probably a reason for it, because maybe for a long time it hasn't been discussed. And yeah, I don't know. I guess, again, I don't really know so much about the art world. For me, it's always seen to be something a little bit like a kind of bit dirty. It's not like I don't have a nostalgic view of the past of the art world. I don't have a nostalgic view of it now. It's where money was involved, where people had been paid to do a portrait of a wealthy person. I don't know what the dynamic was there and whether that was a kind of glory days or not. But obviously it's a big market and it's a big capitalist market, and it uses different stories to sell work. And personally, I'm happy that there's a new wave of people that haven't had access to it are having access to that money and to that platform. And some of them are good artists, some are not, and that's kind of been the case probably the history of art. Again, I'm not an expert on it, but I've seen some bad art hanging on the walls of galleries, and I've seen some amazing art. I don't have the language to talk about what makes good art or not, but I know when I'm moved by an artwork. I know when I see a beautiful piece of craft. Again, seeing like Kerry James Marshall at the RA, an amazing exhibition that is beyond just the stories of slavery and post-colonialism, is an amazing painter, and many people think that. And I personally I love the colour and the layering and the way he moves through different styles across the rooms. But then there's lots of art that doesn't move me. But I guess my question is, even the word woke, again, I don't, it is, has often been used in a pejorative way. I understand that language changes. Originally it was meant as a kind of term for African Americans, race activism, to be awake to social injustice. And now it used to be to describe people that are, trying to fit into certain boxes or whatever. It has changed, but I guess what's the point of this discussion? What are we trying to do? Are we trying to make better work? Are we trying to give people more access to the art? Are we trying to feel more free about how we experience things? I guess that for me is kind of, I want to, I'm a builder. I want to know what do we do next? How do we build? I'm not really interested in kind of complaining about stuff that isn't nice. Like, that's fine. If I get to curate a show, then I just won't pick the things I don't like. And I'm sure that's the case with a lot of other people. And, what's next? What do we want to do? And I guess often it's about money and attention, isn't it? So where do we want to spend that? Don't know. Something to talk about?
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm a bit stuck because I agree with JJ on most of his characterization, and I'm not going to repeat what he said. And I guess what I could do is to do what an art critic I don't think should do. I'm going to try to approach like a structural history and try to understand what art is for. And I haven't quite fleshed this out, so bear with me and maybe tell me where I'm wrong or propose a solution. So I've been trying to think about how we can historically understand, not like year by year, but different ways in which people have come to the production of art and what they've expected of it. And I sort of wager that it is possible that we've ended up where we have ended up because all of these functions have sort of collapsed into one. The one might be the politics that JJ responded, but maybe that has happened, maybe not. Let's figure this out. So one of the first reasons that we might practice art is to express our individual creativity. We're all familiar with the narrative of the creative industries. We're told that, it's a massive skills shortage. We need to be teaching children GCSE art, not because that's good for them, but because it's sort of like, well, actually, no, because it is good for them, but it's also something that becomes appropriated into a commercial narrative. So individual expression that builds into a sort of commercial narrative is one of the first ways that we think about a purpose of art. A second that we noticed much more operational within the art world that I've identified is the strand of myth making, or in contemporary art parlance, worlding. This is kind of a slightly unruly word that's been used recently. In that, I would classify all sorts of artistic making that has as its purpose the creation of a mythos for a community, for a nation, the idea of bringing people together, giving them an understanding of who they are, giving them an understanding of why they are together. And this is something that contemporary art, the paradigm of artistic practice that has developed post-1960s, has really excelled at and accelerated at. And it's had access to a particular theoretical apparatus that makes it eloquent in the way that it motivates itself as it does this. So this is what JJ was referring to when he brought up the example of the Sami artists at Tate Modern. This is sort of an example of an artwork which tells us we must conceive of the Sami people in a particular way. This is how it's mediated both within the land, within the culture. This is how it's mediated in the West. And one of the interesting things, of course, to note is that as contemporary art has taken on this mantle, we have sort of completely lost interest in figuring out how this worlding creates our own world. In the politics of inclusion, undeniably, certain voices have sort of fallen by the wayside. I wouldn't go as far as to say that certain traditional Western canonical voices have been excluded entirely. I think that's an overstatement. But certainly attention to that kind of communal myth-making has lost its focus. Quite closely related to this kind of telos purpose of artistic creation, I think could be social cohesion, social empowerment. It's different from the previous strand in as much as it's a lot more utilitarian. And I think Maria could perhaps speak to that. And I'm using the word utilitarian, and it's negative as well as positive. Contemporary arts like post-97 has exerted a lot of energy into patching up social structures. So we've kind of given off, we've fired social workers, we've replaced them with much cheaper but also a lot less efficient artists. These kind of projects have been rolled out throughout Britain. Lots of biennials have been dealing with. We had a whole kind of period in the 2010s where contemporary art biennials around the world were sort of like pretending to be social projects, making people soup and feeding the homeless in Athens for like one afternoon every other Tuesday and saying social change has happened. So yeah, those two things, myth-making and social cohesion, are kind of closely together. And I think they are a combination of the work of the state, but also the kind of politics that JJ referred to. And there are two more things that I think we neglect or we forget about in understanding what art might be for. One is the idea of aesthetic discovery. So we have this kind of myth of the avant-garde, complicated term in itself, but we have this idea that artists used to be able to do whatever artists do, and we would end up knowing something about ourselves, not necessarily just to create a nation in the way that I mentioned before, but actually novel ideas would come. We can romanticize the Russian avant-garde, for instance, or the surrealists. These are real developments. Now, I think we have sort of forgotten what to do with this because we've become very easily satisfied with a narrative of positivist knowledge. So my example in artistic practice, another architectural practice, I'm so sorry, this was not intentional, there happened to be a hobby horse, the artistic collective, artistic research collective called Forensic Architecture, who you might know from the Turner Prize a few years ago. Their work is essentially like doing high-intensity, positivist, forensic investigations into things like war crimes, into ecological crimes, and they present them as artwork. And that is a fundamentally avant-garde practice in as much as some kind of knowledge is being produced, and we have all, as audiences, as the art world, accepted what they present to us. But I think that has a cost, because we've essentially, the avant-garde now is the same as the disinformation people. Yeah, so forensic architecture and Mariana Spring sort of occupy the same sphere for me. But I think there's a gap there. And the final category, which I will say only 2 words about because it's completely blank, is art as a form of belief, art as a form of cultivating belief, dealing with the inexpressible, the uncanny, the untestable. Maybe it will be a big claim to say that, the Reformation kind of ruined this for places like Britain. Protestantism is not so interested in the image. Maybe this is not something that contemporary art in an atheist word can really do. But this will be interesting to figure out. Now, I've brought all of this up to be able to sort of highlight a couple of things that I wonder whether they might be changing. So this is with the view to prognosticate what has changed, what could be changing that drives all of the strands that I just described. Well, first is that the institutions are sort of collapsing. They are and they aren't. Institutions are collapsing in as much as the capital's interest and the state's interest in propagating through the institutions isn't particularly strong anymore. And I have an interesting kind of example of what might happen. How we have seen post-woke art in action, enabled through statist reforms and sort of like capital reforms. And that is an example of what happened in Poland over the last, until a couple of years ago, for 8 years. So 2010s into the 2020s, under the populist PIS government, who, in the 2 terms in power, went about firing all the old guard, liberal, pro-EU institutional directors. They got to art very late. They thought heritage horse breeding farms were more important to go and to do state takeover of before they got to the museums. And by the time they did, the change was marked, but the change revealed that there's a sort of vacuum. It wasn't clear when the museums in Warsaw got new directors what it is that their museums could be filled with. So this to me indicates that we should be quite wary of thinking that just changing the regime, as might be happening under Trump, that makes art better. Deep, sorry. I could just stop there, but I'm going.
We'll have another chance.
Yeah, but I think the way that I would continue this is to try to think of all the other functions and figure out, is anything going to change in our politics? Is anything going to change in our religious beliefs? And is there anything coming up that might help us think of individual creativity? I think that would be a good way to try to prognosticate in any sense.
Okay, so I have the difficult task of coming last. I think the good thing about this question is that there's so many different ways you can take it. So I'm actually going to start with theatre, but I will be coming back to visual arts quite soon in my talk. So last month I had the misfortune of going to see the latest theatrical production of Dracula at the Lyric Hammersmith. Has anyone seen this show or heard of it? No.
I haven't seen it. I know it would be awful.
Yeah.
Yeah, not wants to.
Yeah. So I began to get suspicious of this production when I read in a review that it was a feminist reworking of the famous novel of 1897. And again, when I sat down for the show in a half-empty auditorium. The bad smell wasn't garlic, but a production that reeked of political didacticism. Instead of Dracula being the villain, it was the alive male characters in the play who overshadowed the female counterparts. I include the word alive because the main message was that the living dead were actually less harmful than the men in the original novel. Suspicion for me had actually arisen a week earlier when I received an email informing me that there would no longer be a half-time interval. I joked afterwards that the break had been removed because it kept audience members from leaving the show halfway through. Ironically, the first words spoken by Count Dracula in the original novel are, "Enter freely and of your own will." Woke art, including theatre, is not captivating enough to hold audiences in place and illustrates the central argument of my speech. In a post-woke era, audience taste, those of the market, will determine what flies and what doesn't. The panel title shouldn't be about what post-woke art looks like, but rather what does it feel like. Post-woke art is something that we should want to experience, and I think we're really seeing this play out with the pithy statement, go woke, go broke. For me, post-woke art is just going to be kind of like the realization of this in slow motion almost. Really, however, I take issue with the identification of a post-woke era. Indeed, if there is such a thing, and this is the current state of theatre, then we need Van Helsing on steroids. The truth is, though, this idea of a post-woke landscape is frankly not true for Britain. Historians usually identify eras in retrospect: the French Revolution, the Dutch Golden Age, the Industrial Revolution. So the idea that a post-woke era can be identified now is wishful thinking by those on the right, and highlights their own politicization of the arts, which is self-defeating. Successful post-woke art, like pre-woke art, will remain popular because it is something that people want to experience. These patterns are identifiable for paid exhibitions at major galleries, public galleries. Between 2018 and 2021, for example, the National Gallery hosted a range of traditional and very conservative exhibitions, and I'd say this was before we could describe any kind of vibe shift. So, for example, Monet in Architecture invited the public to see the father of Impressionism in an entirely new way, exploring his career as a daring young artist who pursued a unique vision. In 2019, visitors were invited to Gauguin Portraits to learn about how the French artist revolutionized the portrait. Upcoming exhibitions include Joseph Wright of Derby and Renoir. These are not responses to a post-woke landscape, but a continuation of existing practices, and it really shows the power of the market. What we can learn from the programme at the National Gallery is that the idea of a stable liberal consensus is more complicated than it seems. Post-woke art indicates a reaction. Conservative art that presents itself as reactionary will only succeed in the short term by using this kind of rhetoric. Shock tactics attract attention by targeting this dopamine-driven craving, and like any addict, the taste will diminish with each repeated hit. Yes, I'm sure it's useful to imagine a liberal consensus dominating politics, but it simply isn't the case. Political reactionaries like Curtis Yarvin will only worsen political polarization whilst making art political itself. I, for one, despair at the MAGA-influenced style of art because they voice strong opinions without understanding contemporary art and dismiss any effort to broaden the canon. Conservative critics too easily lament the loss of beauty without offering a compelling vision to replace it. So Curtis Yarvin's attempt to represent the US at the 2026 Venice with a pavilion themed around Titian's Rape of Europa is frankly quite lame and indicates an artistic scene unable to generate new ideas. And I was thinking maybe Frieze should be called Frozen instead. Maybe I'm being too optimistic, but contemporary art is lively and enjoyable. The buzz around Frieze, for me, I find it genuinely energetic. Although I had to say I haven't been this year. I had to spend the day next door at Regent's Park at the zoo instead. Another work task, but anyway. So for me, a young person in the arts, I go to a lot of groups. I meet a lot of women and men my own age who are all enthusiastic about art. And they promote in-person meetings, networking, the exchange of new ideas. These spaces are not motivated by politics, but the joy of discovery. Online complaining about so-called woke art is also is like a vampire itself. And I hope a post-woke reaction doesn't override such movements because the gains enhance art rather than detract from it. So, for example, I enjoy visiting the Wallace collection to see traditional pieces, but I also want to explore how new artists offer fresh perspectives and help to expand the canon. This way we can appreciate visual culture and the broader arts in a new light. That being said, the most valuable insight from the notion of post-woke art is that the public and curators may be more confident in resisting shows and acquisitions motivated by politics as a mean in itself. And I think we're all broadly in agreement that political art as a means in itself is quite boring, and the public is not what the public want, quite broadly. Quite often in exhibition programs, the ticketed exhibitions are more conservative because they actually have to pay for themselves, while there'll also be displays, mini displays, maybe rehanging of the permanent collection, which reflect the more political motivations of the curators themselves. They don't need to make money on these shows, so there's no one to challenge them. So post-woke art will reflect a consciousness of what the public wants to see and experience, driven by the need to raise funds. In this context, openly didactic artworks and art forms will be resurrected as vampire-like spectres from the blood of taxpayers.
Before I open up to the audience, it'd be good to just come back to the panel for some brief comments, in response to what the other speakers have said. JJ, do you want to start? I mean, one thing might sort of particularly put to you that, we've had other mentions of exhibitions. Kerry James Marshall, for example, fantastic exhibition at the Royal Academy, which might be considered as a product of a so-called woke era, a focus on a Black American artist. Although, as we've said, a fantastic exhibition. But the question is there a tendency for political art to be bad, in general? That's something that occurred to me, because otherwise what's the problem? Because Maria asked some pertinent questions here.
Well, I think that Maria's right to I think there's an easy reactionary thing that I think Ella is kind of trying to fend off and to put back in its place, which is to kind of be a complainer about I'm being hard done by because everybody else is getting a piece of the action now, right? Meaning that those groups, minorities who were largely excluded from the art world, right, and the market and its institutions, and that now have access to it, and that there's something sort of facile and empty about that, and tokenistic and so on. I don't, first of all, I don't have any issue with equality, right, and equal access and open opportunity, right. I've studied the art world, the London and British art world of the 70s, and it was a shockingly white, because it was male, right, unbelievably male, right, and it took huge exception to anybody who tried to sort of do anything different, right. It was a closed shop. So at one level, it's completely banal to there's no reason to kind of concern oneself with the fact that we've become a more liberal society that isn't riddled with prejudice, right? That means, but the point about Kerry James Marshall is a terrific painter. Now, whether Kerry James Marshall is being showcased, and this is a very important point, and it's absolutely correct to bring it up, is Kerry James Marshall being showcased because he's a black painter, right? Or is he being showcased because he's a terrific painter who paints also about the black experience, right? And I would prefer it to be the second one. Another terrific example of this is a young painter who died a little while ago, quite some time ago, Noah Davis, who I think is a terrific painter and also understood himself as a black American artist to also want to be working at the height of the tradition. Right, so this is something you notice in both those painters, that if you look at Kerry James Marshall, it is absolutely ensconced in the history of the painted image in the Western tradition, right, if you look carefully. So I think it's really critical to insist that what is important is that we talk about why things are good as art, and that requires a more universal discussion about criteria, about values, about what we cherish, right? What we believe in and what we care for, right? And that requires us to think about things like aesthetics, right? What is it about? I mean, in architecture too, right? In all these forms, I think in many ways the problem is, and we should discuss this. The problem I see now in all the creative arts, including design, architecture, and so on, is that there is a sort of giving up on the specificity of the discipline, of its tradition, of its history, of its intellectual and critical traditions, all in order to sop some major policy or cultural shibboleth now, right?
So, yeah, good point to pause on. Marie, if I could come to you. I mean, I think you're being a little bit either modest or, disingenuous to say, I'm not an artist, because you have a major piece of work in free sculpture. And anyway, since Marcel Duchamp, anything that's in a museum is art, and anyone can be an artist, surely. So I think, leaving definitions aside, I mean, I think I'd like to hear your answer to your own question, which is, what is it we're trying to do? And, you did mention freedom, which I thought was interesting that you mentioned that, because that's really important for architects as well as artists. So,
Gosh, what we're trying to do. Thank you. I don't know. It is a good question whether I'm an artist or not, because it's something, maybe that's a different discussion, but I do kind of agree with JJ about, like discipline and education and attention. And I don't know. Yeah. But obviously these terms have been kind of thrown around, so it doesn't really matter. But I have made art, things that are considered to be art. But what we're trying to do, I don't know. I guess, I guess it's natural to try and define things and protect things. And I don't know. I think maybe I'm just, as a child of kind of Soviet era, I don't have a kind of expectation that everything should be free and everyone should just get what they want, and there's a kind of meritocracy and everything is always the way it should be, and the big institutions should represent this or that. It's like, I don't know, it's kind of, things are kind of progressing the way they're progressing, and certain trends and movements mean that there's a lot of things that are maybe superficial, but it also means that maybe artists like Kerry James Marshall are becoming more in a kind of popular domain, and maybe before, I don't know, again, I'm not an expert, but maybe before not as many people would be as interested in finding out more about him. And he is an amazing artist, but there's so much stuff in the world, so many people making things, and how do you even sort them? How do you find, how do you choose? And I guess these things which might be superficial and are just trends, they bring certain things to attention, and then you find an amazing diamond, within it, that you wouldn't have seen before. So I think that has a value. So I don't know. I don't know, like, speaking about stuff, like why are we so obsessed about having to speak about things and that be okay? I don't know. I think it's overrated. Like, go and make some art. It's so hard, you know? To get something into Frieze. Like, you know, because we took part in Frieze this year, and it was an amazing opportunity. All these people and amazing artists, and I don't know, it's really hard logistically to even make something that goes into Frieze. The amount of money and work and time and connections, and, you know, well done for even getting in there. I don't know. I don't know. I think personally I want to focus my energy. You know, life's short. I want to focus it on the things I like, and kind of celebrating artists that I think are amazing artists, and not worrying about all the other stuff, because it's always going to be there. You know, there's always rubbish. You know, it's like trying to find crisps in a shop these days. You know, if you're like in Hackney like me and you go to a shop and there's like 20 types of, you know, crisps, and I don't know, it's just difficult, isn't it?
Wow.
Yeah, so I just focus on things that you like, I think.
Yeah. I mean, it is true that there's a sort of bewildering array of work. When you go to Frieze, London, it's, you know, it's incredibly hard to sort of put your finger on, you know, what the vibe is today. And I think that's, you know, that kind of fragmentation or diversity of approaches is quite difficult to deal with. Whereas when you go to Frieze Masters, I don't know if everyone's aware of this kind of the great rise of Frieze Masters, which is sort of, I think, perhaps the big phenomenon within the so-called contemporary art world, is that, you know, the most popular thing is not the contemporary art, it's the kind of the classics that everyone feels safe about. You know, you can go and see non-objective art from revolutionary Russia, and we're all like, oh, this is nice and comforting, which is, you know, a sort of bizarre thing, isn't it? That the original meaning of these works is sort of completely lost. But yeah, I mean, it would be interesting to know, well, any comments generally, but also I think this thing of, you know, what are we trying to do? But also, what is this vibe shift? What is, you know, what, you don't need to speculate, but looking around, how can we characterize what's currently shifting?
I think we're just entering kind of a period of vacuum from which God knows what will emerge. I found Frieze just mind-numbingly boring this year, and not for its diversity. It's actually for its, bizarre to think about it now, for its lack of actually a common script. One can think of Frieze sort of circa 2012, much earlier than that, like pre-2008, where every other gallery was showing video. This was like daring times, you know, throw money away. Who's going to buy this? People were buying video. Who knew? None of this is happening anymore. You know, we went through different years with different iterations. It was racial minorities, it was queer artists, and biennials also went through all of this social outreach, minoritized groups, political interest, and so on and so on. But the last couple of years, we have been seeing kind of a dissolution of all of those, and a collapse onto themselves, to the extent that it's no longer possible for even the institutions to mediate which interest they would end up promoting. My friend Hal over there in the audience has this great theory that actually all we're going to get is climate change forever, because that's sort of evergreen and no one is really going to argue with that. We can have a bit of a queers versus black artists strife, so that doesn't work out, but everyone has to care about reindeer at the Turbine Hole. But I don't think that's necessarily kind of useful for the task of figuring out what's happening next. The question might be that's useful is to what we would want to be new. And I think the sort of reactionary movement in its infancy it might include in the more bombastic terms people like Curtis Yarvin, who Ella referred to astutely, but also a much smaller scene that exists in London of reactionary artists who might include people like Alexander Adams. These are essentially artists who sort of wish that the 20th century hadn't happened. And I'm not bringing them up to necessarily say that this is a dead end, but what it helps to do is to make us ask whether we want the forms to be new or whether we want the questions and the ideas to be new. And I think, the reactionary artist probably gets that a little bit wrong because they like to paint like it's 1890, the revolutions haven't yet happened. And then they're surprised and they're disappointed that it doesn't address 2025, though there is a small audience for this anyhow.
Let's bring a little now. Yeah. Hello. So, what do you want to be new? I mean, what should art be doing now?
I mean, I think if we had a set answer to that, art would be very boring. To me, I want there to be lots of friction. I want there to be a lot of like grassroots movement that create debate, that inspire idea, bring new voices in. And I'm quite on board with what's been said earlier. I think we should just kind of not speak too much about it, but actually just do it and go to the shows we want to go and see and not be too concerned about what's fitting a certain ideology or not. But that doesn't mean to ignore representing what you believe, but it means to kind of act rather than complain, in a broad sense. I think, yeah, so.
Okay, well, look. Let's heard some really interesting points here. I'm sure you've got loads of things to say. So we don't have to have microphones in here, do we? Which is great. Yep.
I thought the analogy to the big day was absolutely brilliant. I find that one of the characteristics of woke art is that it claims to be insurgent, where there's in actual fact it's the official culture of an institution. It's both wanting to be pertaining to be addressing ideologically an issue, whilst in actual fact reinforcing its effect in the shared institutional ideology. And therefore it must continually resurrect tradition as a means, as a holy character not down. And that's why I think the constant statue, the demounting of that, just the kind of woke art ad par excellence, because it actually resurrected something that was in the topic realm where people had just been ignoring it, drew attention to it so it could therefore cast it down. So tradition becomes formally dominant in the post-quote world, as it is beginning to do in architecture, which is the world I know, or it ceases to become, ceases to become a subject. It must become something. So although your question was, what do you want to be new in art? It's like, where is the tradition? JJ, what part of tradition is retained and what is cast aside?
Okay, at the back.
Yeah, I would say I agree with what you say. I feel like with woke art, the issue is it's quite hard to say that you don't like it, because I feel like after the 2010s, there started to come all these movements, but we started talking about stuff, then it got to 2018 around about where you stopped being able to say anything other than what, like, you feel completely with them, otherwise you'd be cast out of the friendship group or you'd lose your job or something like that. And so we've gotten to a point where we have to meet this sort of like AI quota of like saying the right thing, rather than actually speaking about anything. And I feel like when you look at AI and like, it's sort of like it's taking all these bits and pieces that should be said, and you start to think about what actually makes good art, and it's sort of like struggling artist thing of like, there must be some sort of friction, there must be some sort of stripe, which is sort of part of you these days, when creating friction means that you're a bad person because you're not doing what people want you to talk about. And I feel like it's also a bit hard because I feel like art is sort of like a language which you're meant to have a conversation with, or what people want you to have a conversation with is like the topics that you shouldn't talk about, like having black people create art that talks about black issues and speaks about racism and what we should do about it. Whereas I feel like that's fine, that's good, but it's the conversation that we have with art shouldn't be about whether it's woke or not, but it should be about how it speaks about the human experience and sort of enlightens us. I feel like, so yeah, but I know it's I feel like the question I was trying to get to is in a world where we can't say the wrong thing, how do we get universities institutions to allow us to speak our stuff up there what we're meant to speak about.
Thank you. Really, really good points there. Yeah.
What I'm interested in is whether there's going to be a change. The public's been mentioned in terms of art markets. If there's going to be changes into treating the public with a bit more on a more equal level, because my definition when I came into this discussion, the definition I've had in my head and what woke art is that you have a sense of being not confronted but scolded, and that the artist is somebody damaged. You are complicit in the damage of the artist somehow, and yeah, I'd really like to see that change.
Okay, yeah, this is a really important question that's come up very briefly in relation to institutions and audiences. We'll definitely come back to that. Yeah,
I think that was a point that I wanted to look at as well, which is I'm looking at this from a point of view that consumer art going to exhibitions, and I think there's been a paradox that has been at play for a number of years, which is when you walk around lots of exhibitions, there is a sense in which people think it's really great to challenge you, to pose questions to you and make you think. But in fact, what really happens is you feel like somehow you're being complicit in some sin, and you're not going there to have moments of, I think as you said, in terms of being moved. So I think that what has really moved me when I've seen exhibitions, I think there's been moments of things that have been where you realise the amazing human faculty of engagement. There was a piece, I saw an exhibition which was called Art into Architecture or something like that, and they had various different things around Soviet art, and it was the supremacists. You could see in relation to architecture that faculty of abstract thinking. And it was a reflection on that made you think about our capacity to think abstractly for something ridiculous like watching Medici or, Blockbuster on TV. If suddenly there's a revelation about the beauty of Botticelli, which you've seen before, but you suddenly saw it in a new way, or something that was really moving in terms of slightly disturbing, which was a Frank Horbach exhibition, which I treated myself to, and I spent a lot of time. I don't really understand Frank Horbach, and I stayed in the gallery for a couple of hours looking at one painting, and suddenly it revealed itself to me. It was like walls blown apart, during the Second World War, and this whole thing just expanded in front of my eyes. And it's things like that where you look at people's engagement in the world and their struggle to understand it and give it meaning. And that's, to me, what art should be. It's not, I think, as you said, it's not that it should be something. It should be our experience of watching somebody else interpret and understand the world. And it's the world. It's not our being scolded. It's about what we see, whether it's landscape, whether it's people, whether it's relationships. And people will help you see that through their eyes. And I think that's what I want to see. And I think that you therefore want to go and experience those things. You don't want to be scolded and told what a bad person you are.
Thank you.
Yep.
In a way, a very cynical thing, but if I think about the presentation of art, so in museums and galleries, it seems to me that you can lift, you could re-exhibit, you could re-present quite a number of exhibitions that I've seen in recent years, which is completely different curatorial interpretations on them. Because an awful lot of what makes art supposedly woke, in whatever the interpretation of the varieties is the interpretation. Take that as what but I mean, that's particularly the case with presentation of historic work. Take that away and just shut up and let us look at it. With sort of the basic information about the artist, maybe materials and not much more. And hey presto, that, a really big part of the problem is actually still on. I mean, the thing that always gets me about the curatorial scripts is that they presume to know what I think. And how? You have no idea. And
I think there's a common theme here. Quite a few people really critical of the role of curators in exhibitions. And as Ella said, you do now have a situation where it's a lot of the sort of temporary displays, the free displays, where you see the curator being able to kind of politicize and interpret the work in this kind of way. But I think it is true to say there's also been more public debate about this. There was a big criticism of the Tate's rehang recently, or not, a year or so ago, and the kind of the kind of patronizing nature of the labels in various exhibitions. So I think there has been more criticism, more debate about this over the last year than perhaps previously. So I think we are seeing a shift. But I mean, I think the whole idea of interpretation in itself, which is, I suppose, what curators do, I don't think this has fundamentally been questioned, and so many museums have a specific person, they employ a specific person now who's responsible for interpretation. And to my mind, that's a kind of quite important question. I heard this fantastic Hungarian orchestral conductor on the radio, and the interviewer, it's from Radio 3, I think, the interviewer said, "So is what you're doing interpreting the composer's idea about this music?" And he said, "No, absolutely not. We're not interpreting it. We're trying to get to the truth of this music and what the composer intended. And that's what we're doing. It's up to the audience to interpret what we've done." And I thought that was such a true thing. But no, so let's see how we're doing for time. Let's have a few more comments, and please ask questions as well. Don't feel you just have to make a point. Welcome any questions. Yeah.
Yeah, no, post can both mean temporally after, in the case of like postmodern or something, but it can also mean sort of intensification. And I'm just wondering, sort of, you can discuss at sort of end of both end of globalism with like the Trump tariffs will affect the art world. But this concept of post, a lot of people come to the art because they're interested in the concept of the avant-garde and sort of what's the new thing that is existing in society, insofar as that's overlapping with now, I guess, some of these reactionary art. Maybe people are thinking, well, like, this is the source of novelty in the world. But at the same time, isn't this itself sort of an intensification of wokeness, insofar as, maybe from the right, insofar as it's dominated with similar questions of identity or any of these political themes just from the other side? But another question is like, okay, so like if that's perhaps insufficient, what are people looking for from art if they're looking for art to sort of lead the way in that avant-garde way? And Ellen was mentioning the idea of sort of the consumer being sort of person who sets the tone. Of course, you could wonder how much donor or funding rules, but if it's the consumer, what will people be looking for? And yeah, I'm not so sure if it will be environment, because sort of the new middle class obsession in all the newspapers and so on is a relationship with the digital, all this concern about decline of reading, which he's concerned. But then, like, okay, so if people are going to the art exhibits wanting something, maybe clever curators going to be like, okay, our next exhibit's going to be playing with this concept of our relationship to the digital, say, how can artists both lead the way as well as respond to either consumer or donor market, as well as form a cohesive narrative, so it's not just a bunch of random stuff clumped together, which say.
Okay, thank you. That's
a good idea.
I think
I'll shut up.
Yeah. Okay.
Hiya. Forgive me if I'm wrong. I really like how the audience, I think there's a real sense of the question, what does post art look like? And the response being a truth, with a capital T, of returning to art, not as a social activism method, but as a observation and a return to a mirror to life. And that being a way of not being a place to judge, but being a place to kind of just say, like, look what reality is and for return to that transcendent. So I think that's just an impression I got from the audience. So yes.
Thank you. Yeah.
Nobody's mentioned beauty, and I just wonder what part that plays.
Great. Thank you. Yeah.
I was wondering what you thought about another kind of post-work. You there talked about the sort of more reactionary conservative impulse, but to me, looking at the scene internationally, like I spend quite a bit of time in China, and to me there's another post-work thing that's happening, which is the elevation of experience. So everybody's said, we look at a piece of art and it touches us mentally, it touches us intellectually in the mind, and it touches us somewhere else, which is to do with feelings. So I've really noticed in a lot of exhibits that I've been to and new galleries that are being designed that the experiential element has been massively elevated. And so the mind, the subject of the artist, and all of those questions almost off the agenda. But some of it's quite good, it's skilled, and it's a great at consumption as you're going to experience it. The Japanese are very good at that, but it's almost as if it isn't art. We've made it so large an act of consumption that it isn't art anymore. It's so much about feeling and experience and an environment that it doesn't touch the mind at all.
That's a really interesting question. The panel hasn't really addressed that. So let's come back to the panel for comments. And just to add to that point, there's a whole rush towards immersive art, and institutions like the Royal Academy desperately trying to get in on the act. So I don't know if anyone saw the Michael Craig Martin exhibition, but there was a sort of immersive digital room there, which is obviously sort of responding to an agenda set more in the private kind of commercial sector with things like, these Van Gogh immersive experiences and so on. So there's loads to come back on. I'll just kind of leave it up to the panel which points they respond to. But it'd be great to, for example, talk about whether the avant-garde is possible, the role of curators and interpretation, and crucially the relationship between audiences and art and institutions. JJ. This isn't the final summing up, by the way. This is an interim.
I think Gemma made a point about the claim that woke art claims to be insurgent. It's actually really the dominant ideology. That's a useful thing to kind of. I'm sorry. God, yeah, sorry. I think that's a very important thing to kind of unpick or work through, because it relates to the questions that come up about the avant-garde too, which is largely a historical notion, right? Or rather, it's become historical because it actually depends on a relationship between the margin and the excluded and the academy, right? And the orthodoxy. That is what the avant-gardes were doing. They were going against the salon, the academy, the mainstream, right? The official account. And what's happened, I think, one of the great confusions of art post-war in the West is precisely the way in which first of all, the avant-gardes were institutionalized so that they became official. And then that has gone through several cycles of its own reinstitutionalization. So 1960s was radical art from the late 1960s was anti-modernist. It was against modernist art and that consensus and orthodoxy, and it became postmodern, and that fed through and then also became institutionalized and again. So this has happened in several ways. And the issue that we have is precisely the confusion about whether the radical progressive wave that is now institutionalized is really progressive, right? And that is a much bigger debate about how those ideas articulate an official or general consensus about how we think about certain ideas, right? So that's really important. Then we have this kind of false reactionary thing which happens, I think, which is that you get artists who are so fed up with just being told off all the time and being cancelled and dogpiled on Twitter, whatever it is. They almost generate this kind of weird little sort of a pseudo kind of performative avant-garde where they hide away in galleries and they end up painting, as Pierre says, retro versions of like Italian futurism, right? Which is all good. Do it, right? But I think the problem is that it's self-stunting. So it comes back so for me, it comes to this issue of like, well, how do we get into something different and better? And it requires us to insist on and start demanding for a degree of plurality and openness within curating, within institutions, within funding, which doesn't require artists to perform. Right? What's massively overlooked in the last 25 years is that all public funding, all support for the arts, and then progressively it's become a kind of set of generic demands on artists. All of that has become attached to the idea that artists should perform certain demands. If you look at the Museums Association website, if you look at the National Council of Museum Directors website, if you look at ICOM, the Conference of International Museums of Modern Art, CIMAM, if you look at any of these networking groups, which are semi-official networking groups between institutions, they all have the same agendas on the front pages: climate change, anti-racism, decolonization. So this entire construct of political agendas is essentially a proscriptive institutionalization of certain agendas that essentially produce artists. So artists are generated, right, by self-selection into being artists who accommodate these agendas. And that's a massive problem, and it has to be addressed, and it has to be acknowledged, and it has to be put back in its box.
Thank you. Maria, do you want to respond to Ben?
I've been enjoying actually hearing people's questions and feedback, because I don't really, you don't kind of hear different perspectives so much, I guess, of why people enjoy art and what moves people. And I think, all the different points about institutions trying to make it relevant to today, whether that's through politics or through technology and experience. I guess it's a kind of existential question about what's the meaning of art to people now. And like when you go to a church, or for example, and you see incredible stained glass windows, you're sort of like, art was this kind of magic, where you have this incredible painted ceiling and you go in and it's a theatre, you've never seen anything like it before, I guess. And I guess it moves you in this other way, as well as also being educational and also being political or whatever, kind of communicating the Bible to people who can't read, for example. It had all those abilities, as well as being beautiful, as someone mentioned, and so what is that equivalent now? And I think we're all just trying to figure it out. I think it's just maybe in my mind quite fragmented, and there's bits here and there, and there's this artist moves you through their politics, this artist moves you through the way they are able to paint, and I guess people are just trying to grapple with this, trying to find this new focus. And I don't have an answer, I don't know, but it sounds like it's important to have plurality. But I don't know, I'm curious to hear more, I guess, from people about it.
I don't know, is it naive to try to tackle the good, the beautiful and the true in a couple of minutes? One of the things that sort of struck me in trying to study the history of aesthetics is that what happens in modernity is that those three sort of collapse onto one another, and we can no longer really distinguish between the categories. That means that we do not really know how to apply judgment, the thing that JJ mentioned a couple of times. Unlike this kind of drive towards plurality, we've given up in the drive to plurality the idea to be able to differentiate between things that are better than others and worse than others, more beautiful than others and less beautiful than others, and also less truthful than others. And where does this leave art, which has sort of collapsed itself, in an age where there's no clear institutional winner for who provides moral guidance to the populace. We hear occasionally about community leaders performing this function, but I think it will be very difficult to practically determine who community leaders in a place like Britain really are and what values they represent and which communities they represent. And I think we're fragmented to the point that that's not necessarily a useful lens. So what does art do? What do arts institutions do when they see themselves as sort of like moral leaders? They sort of try to do all of these three things at the same time. And the beautiful, it turns out, isn't really so important in the long run, because when you have the monopoly on showing people what art is, they will just accept it. And this is fine. This is what institutions are for. But out of the triad, I would have suggested that annoyingly, the beautiful was the one thing that art was for, rather than the academy in the sort of knowledge sense, rather than, I don't know, theology for the sense of a good. And I'm not even mentioning this as someone who's in a reactionary way would like to go back to the old settlement, but it would be nice to try to disambiguate what it is that we're trying to do. And like very quickly to bring examples of the points that were raised. One of the reasons that the institutional interpretation is so convoluted is that it has to deal with exactly all of those things at the same time. We have a moral agenda with climate change. Tim brought up the idea of sort of resurrection of the past in a fetishistic way. And it does lead us to a question of like who ends up checking all of this. I as a critic, I'm so bored of having to go into exhibitions and say, well, this is very interesting, but you are telling me untruths. And actually, not at the level of, I'm looking at this and aesthetically I think you're a bit off, but like the overt statements about what has happened in art history, what has happened in the world are just untrue. And it's so boring. We've been so many years of this. I don't want to ever have to write another piece when the premise of this exhibition on paper is wrong. Occasionally, the work can still look good when it's made on false promises, but that's a fluke, I would suggest. So yeah.
Let's stop there for a sec. Ella, I just wondered if you could maybe address the point a few people asked about audience and the relationship between institutions, exhibitions.
Yeah, that was a point I really want to stress, so it's good that you asked me to. So the division between the public and then curators is like a really important issue. And I was thinking about, there was a survey that was taken in 2013 called Britain Thinks. And this asked members of the public, what do you think the purpose of a museum or a gallery should be? And I think the people who were running the questionnaire were hoping it would be like, oh, anti-racism, that kind of thing. But actually what they found is that the thing that the public hated the most was being lectured at. Actually, when they went to a gallery, they wanted to have a leisurely day out with the kids, entertainment. They wanted to kind of learn new things. So they found all this and they put them in a kind of a hierarchy, and it was consistently against being lectured at, scolded. But what's happened since? Like, they haven't taken up this feedback on board. Now, 3 years ago, I designed a questionnaire where I asked curators what they thought of the institutions, the purpose of exhibitions, and their answers were so out of sync with the public responses. And I think what really shocks me is that when quite political stunts are made in institutions, there's a very famous case, I mention it so much just because it's a very useful way to think about these issues, is when a particular painting was taken off the wall at Manchester Art Gallery, Hylas and the Nymphs, because it showed nude women, and the curators kind of interviewed people who were in the gallery, apparently, who criticised this depiction of a nude. So they took it off the wall. Now, it caused outrage, but the curators didn't think, oh, this is obviously it was curated badly, this stunt. They blamed the public for not understanding what they'd done. So my major issue is that I think when curators take things away, they censor things, that completely cuts the conversation. So there's two issues here. We can either scold the public by putting these things which complicate the issue, or they can just take off the work completely, which kills this idea of conversation that someone mentioned at the back, art is conversation. And I think as well, in terms of thinking about audience base, we talked about entertainment and experience in museums. That reflects a shift in the literature. before museums and galleries were collections based, so the curators would be very much working with the artworks and thinking about the artworks themselves. And now that shift to audience based. And I think when you take away ideas of beauty or, artworks which feel quite truthful that a lot of people relate to, what do you have left? I think curators are left with having to try to create an institution which at least you can have a good experience. I Tate Modern, I just despise what it's turned into, but I can still go there for a coffee and enjoy myself there that way. So I think maybe those are some ways that we can fracture the conversation.
Okay. So we've got time for a few more points, but if you could keep your points quite short, we can get as many people in as we can. Yeah.
This is kind of by way of the final question, in terms of what would you do about it. What do you think about a future government doing a kind of Trumpian thing, maybe taking it even further, just destroying all arts institutions? Because I kind of don't feel artists are to blame. I'm not sure how much institutions are such to blame, but I just would be interested in your thoughts about whether actually arts institutions like art schools and arts council and maybe public funding galleries, whether they're more of a problem than a support.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. I suppose one area left that we can touch upon is the Arts and Humanities Research Council, which runs a lot of practice-based work of artists, researchers, and so forth. So that seems to be, when I go to quite a lot of exhibitions now, I noticed that good. So there was a doctor this year who singing and from what I understand is the case that seems to be happening is a greater I suppose theorization of the artist as theorist, as cultural theorist, as practitioner at the same time, praxis spirit. Now that seems to be shaping what it's perhaps the arts that's going to be coming out for the next 10 years or so. As my perception, and it ties in with the whole thing of experiential art and situation, because you're starting to see that it's supposed to be innovative. Art needs to innovate, and there's kind of partnerships and networks creating immersive art that can fund with immersive art projects, and that seems to be where things are going. And it's quite interesting. I think they're kind of jealous of that. Upper experience, putting your away there Friday, then they'll pass you the snooze box.
I'm going to have to stop you, man.
No, just saying that. Is that where art's go? It could be more immersive, but then also still identity driven in that.
Yeah, at the back there. Yeah.
Just wanted to key into some of the discussions around aesthetics, and Pierre mentions the good, the true, and the beautiful. I got that order right. And Vicky, you mentioned something about interpretation, and that reminded me of a book that I read with some friends a few years ago, Susan Sontag's Against Interpretation. And I wanted to mention it because, the idea of what is good and beautiful and true sounds dry, but I think it could sound dry, but I also think it's absolutely vital. She has this fantastic idea that she calls intellectual erotics, is what she's arguing for, and that interpretation is kind of getting in the way of an intellectual erotics. I think it's a nice framing of what we might mean by aesthetics. Aesthetics is Greek for sensation, the kind of thinking about sensation, the logic of sensation, and I like that framing because it hints towards a depth with that intellectual side, but it hints towards also an immediacy of joy, of desire, of being drawn to something that might involve exploration, discovery, and joy. And so I just wanted to raise that. And I also wanted to just throw in that we can talk about the academicization of art as part of the story of how we got here. But I teach art in a secondary school, having been an academic previously. And one of the things that I just wanted to throw into this discussion is that aesthetics never really left
teaching at the level that I teach at in the same kind of way. And students have to produce something that is informed by an understanding of aesthetics. I get to be the guy that introduces my students to the idea of the sublime, amongst other things. It's a fun job, and it has to come into it for them to actually get that GCSE or that A level.
Thank you. Yeah. Yes, you.
I wonder if the panel are being too soft on woke, because to me it's more than just an agenda or set of agendas. To me, I think woke is actually Philistinism turned into a practice. It's actually taking a thing, de-essentializing it very specifically. It's called decolonization or something like this, but it's basically an indifference to the essence of the thing itself. It's turned into a way of doing it. So that's what woke is. So the agendas are secondary. The first thing is to take the discipline and remove the discipline from it. So something as even stupid as how do you choose an actor for a role is not anymore about how they look and how they act, or even whether they're available on a particular day. It's because they have a particular role in society that they need to fulfill. That's it. And if you want to defend those choices on the basis of beauty or the sublime, it ring fences itself using the new kind of ideology that is impervious to all of those ideas. You can't. So this is why the emphasis on trap, the opposite of woke is not trap. The opposite of woke has to be free, has to be has to be artists basically restating whatever they think their art needs to be for, I think, in the first instance.
Okay. I'm really sorry, but it's 12:29, and so we have to finish in 1 minute's time. But I want to ask the panel to just address in like almost one sentence. Wendy's question is, what would you do? Would you do a Trump on the institutions? Would you fund artists directly? What would you do, JJ?
I think that's on a hiding to nothing, doing a Trump. The point being that you would have to unpick, or have to abolish, or have to fire a whole range of networks within institutions, within the humanities, within academia in general. The point is, that's not a battle of ideas, right? Sacking people, firing people, suppressing them, giving them a taste of their own medicine, right? Or, we're going to cancel you back, all that shit. It's not going to work, because at root, the issue is what are the principles and values that we share, that we want to share as a society, so that we can function openly and freely as a society, right? Beauty. Hang on, I'm just going to finish, because beauty is really important. Beauty is, it depends which flavor of beauty you're after. I'm a real Kantian, right? And the reason I like Kant is because his notion of beauty is also about the plurality and the openness to be in society together with other free human beings, trying to address each other's subjectivity equally and freely, right? About what it is that pleases them and what it means, and we don't have that right now. And if we don't get back to those kinds of open dialogues about the value of a particular thing amongst particular people who are a community and a culture, we go nowhere at all.
Maria, what would you do?
I would begin by having gratitude. I think if you're in London, there's 1,000 galleries that have all sorts of art in them. Some you like, some you don't like, some are whatever, traditional, new, futuristic, and just go and focus on the things you like, because in London we have so much stuff. I don't really know what the problem is.
Yeah.
Okay, to be slightly difficult, I think the Trumpian experiment is worth watching. The thing I didn't say about the experiment that took place in Poland is that it did, when it was reversed by a liberal government, it did produce a shift. The institutions did not go back to woke. The institutions are again liberal, but they're not as hysterical as they were when they were in opposition. And Trump's second term, culturally, is also producing very different responses. At the moment, we're still in a kind of vacuum moment, but the experiment is producing something. I don't think this is going to necessarily produce good work, but it might help us reshape the institutions, which, if we don't do something with them, are just going to become obsolete.
I just wanted to say, kind of comment on curating, and a call out to the audience.
You have to say what you do.
Yeah, we're going to get to it. So we were talking about curating. creating is really difficult. There's lots of hurdles, and it's made worse by people who are very political, and they use every opportunity to stop what you're doing. So you're kind of ground down to the end where you just kind of have to go along with it, unfortunately. As the public, what you should do is you should write to these institutions. You should request the artworks that you want to see on display that have been taken off. So there might be curators who are on board with what you think, and then they have the evidence to show those people who are within the institutions putting a break on what they're doing, that this is what the public want and this is what we should do.
Brilliant. Thank you so much to our panelists and to you for all your great questions. I thought that was a really brilliant discussion, really helpful. Cheers.
Thank you for listening to Arts First. You can subscribe for free and listen to all of our episodes at our Substack website. You'll find that at artsfirst.uk. There you'll find relevant links, images, programme notes and other resources, and of course our donations page. You don't have to sign up for access, but if you do, you'll be kept informed of new episodes and articles as they come out. You can also listen to episodes on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and on our YouTube channel. If you like what we do, enjoy our podcasts, agree with some of our concerns on freedom of expression in the arts, for example, then we'd really appreciate any support, ideas and feedback. Tell your friends, share our episodes, sing our praises on social media. But for now, many thanks and we'll see you next time.